Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to read part of Douglas Jardine's book, The Mad Mullah of Somaliland. And this is a book that was published in early 1920s. Now, Douglas Jardine was a British colonial administrator in Somaliland. And he was like maybe second or third in command, and he served in that office from 1916 to 1921. The book itself was published in early 1920s. The book is about Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. It's more or less a biography of his, but of course, it's very negative about him. That's a fact we have to acknowledge. And of course, Douglas Jardine was his enemy. And in the 1920s, he was a British, and most British officers and administrators, of course, were interested in propping up the colonial government in Somaliland. So we need to bear that in mind. So in this part I'm reading is a very interesting part, something that I did not expect. Turns out, even though I've mentioned it in another video, that sometimes we assume that during colonial time, everybody in Europe supported colonization. Actually, that's not what it was. There were very many people who were very, very, very against it because they saw it as something that was not appropriate. And this part I'm reading is a very good example of that. Turns out that there was even a politician in the UK who basically supported Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. And at some point, it seems like they did have a communication between them. And at some point, he was even to come visit him. I don't know whether it actually happened, but he seemed like he was to come visit him. And this politician described him as somebody who was fighting for something that they needed to fight for. Even though he was a politician, it seems like he was a member of Parliament, House of Commons. And he thought that Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was doing what he was supposed to do, and he supported him. And we are going to read, and this is what he says. In the last few pages, we have considered the Mullah's motives and actions as impartially as possible, with a view of removing misconceptions about the nobility of his aim and objects. Now, this sentence is is the opposite of what it is, or it's saying the opposite of what Douglas Jardine stood for, because he says, now, this is after he had told us that Mohammed Abdullah Hassan's primary goal was all about preaching, and his political grievances were just an excuse. That's what he says, and I've said that in another video, that Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was not committed to the political grievances that he was, of course, telling everyone about, that his main goal was religious. And now he's telling us that he's tried to cover that in a very impartial way. There is nothing impartial about it, actually. And if you watch the video where I did about the motives of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, you realize there's nothing like impartiality here. Douglas Jardine was very subjective, was very, he was nothing but impartial. Like, he was a British colonial administrator who was interested and had the motivation to try to defend the British colonization of Somaliland. So there is no way he was going to be impartial in his coverage of Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. He continues that such misconception exists cannot be doubted, but he acknowledges that actually there are people who saw Mohammed Abdullah Hassan's campaigns as justified. And he seems like he's talking about those misconceptions existing in the UK, in Britain, not even in Somaliland. Like, there were actually Europeans who kind of like thought that maybe Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was justified in what he was doing. And since the way Douglas Jardine writes about it, he was annoyed about that. He was very annoyed about that. He continues, for there is a type of politician who delights in throwing the cloak of romance over the shoulders of any ruffian who chooses to camouflage himself as a patriot in revolt against a malign British government. So there is this politician, and in the end, he does not mention his name. That shows you that he was very angry with him. And the fact that he was a politician and in the House of Commons, that's a person he should have mentioned or should have told us the name. He did not want to, because that tells you that there was emotion on his side, a very negative emotion towards this politician. And he says that there are these politicians who would just throw their support to anybody who claims that they are fighting for they are patriots of their nations. You can feel the disappointment in him, and it's even more than just a disappointment. He continued to say, In the House of Commons, a prominent Irish nationalist who boasted that he had received an invitation from the Mullah to go to him on a 3 month visit once described the Mullah and his dervishes as brave men striving to be free. So there is this Irish nationalist who seems like he's in the House of Commons, which is very interesting in itself because at this time the Irish had a problem with the British and they were fighting. They were also trying to be independent. And maybe that can explain to you what was happening. This Irish member of the House of the Commons saw in Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, he saw himself in him that this is a man just like us, the Irish, fighting for the freedom of his people. And that's why he felt like there was that's why there was an understanding from him, and even him describing him as brave men striving to be free, which is actually what it was. But Douglas Jardine is so disappointed with this politician, very much so. And he says such a statement is one of those untruths which constitute the most dangerous falsehood in that they have some appearance of veracity. Actually, he's the one doing untruths that are very dangerous, but he puts it on this other guy, this Irish politician, that he's the one who is telling very dangerous untruths. That's how propaganda works, actually. There is a lot of projection when it comes to propaganda, where a person will accuse you of what they're actually doing. And when they do that, they change the narrative. They make the narrative fit a certain path. And that can be very dangerous because many people, especially those don't have the time to dig a little bit, can get so easily deceived. Because I can tell, for example, or I can say, person who read this book, a British person, thinking in the 1920s, 1930s, and they read this book, they definitely were so easily going to be deceived that Douglas Jardine was a good guy, and this Irish politician was the bad guy who was supporting other bad guys. Those are my random thoughts.